So, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's a beautiful way to set us up for our second panel this afternoon. And this is a panel that really looks at the question of how might we go about improving food security by really accelerating the work that we're doing around climate adaptation. And I think the significance of this panel is important because if we go back to the IPCC report of 2022, it tells us unequivocally that despite our greenhouse emissions coming out of Africa being relatively less than other parts of the world, we know that Africa is disproportionately impacted. And so, in addition to that, you also have a downward trend when it comes to agricultural production. And in fact, the research tells us that down by almost 61%, 34% rather, from 1961. 34% from 1961. And so this really positions us to have a meaningful conversation to say, how might focusing on food security really help us to improve the continent-wide resilience that we're looking for. Now, to lead us into this conversation is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Kala Holdings, Gada Hamuda. Let's give her a massive round of applause. As she comes up, allow me to also just a quick reminder, if you're online, we're still in conversation with you. We're looking forward to your questions and your comments. And Madame Gada will introduce her panelists and take over from here. Over to you, Madame. Nola Richards? Instead of Helmi. Yeah. Okay, so I can call out the names. Nola Richards is already standing by. Let's give her a round of applause. We can be generous. And then, of course, we also have Helmi Abdul Ish. Thank you very much, sir. Let's give him a round of applause. I'll come to this side. And we're going to round it up with Elizabeth Nyamayaro, who is a special advisor to the WFP. Let's give her a round of applause as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I apologize, we had last minute change in some of the names. So I really welcome each and every one of you. It's been a bit of a challenge to try to come across and make it all here. I think just from reflecting on where we are at today, it's very clear. We cannot build the future using the same. Hello? Yeah. Thank you. So we cannot build the future using the same formula that got us here today. If we do not start acting in scale, we are committing as a species, as we keep hearing, a group suicide. So I think it is a moment where we all have to I love being at COP. It's a very proud moment for me as an Egyptian to be here today. Why? Because it's after 26 COPs. This is a COP of action. It is a COP of implementation. It's a COP that's inclusive, that's bringing in the private sector finally at last and recognizing its role and importance. And if we look and zoom in on all the types of insecurities that climate change is causing, whether it's energy insecurity, water insecurity, food insecurity, food and agriculture system today is so fragile and highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as droughts, extreme weather events with roughly 1 billion people hungry and food prices skyrocketing. As impacts from this climate change continue to accelerate and population continue to grow, it will be essential that we start to establish more resilient agri-food systems and protect against the negative impacts of the food insecurity on people, economy, and the planet. Major systemic transformations will be required along the food value chain, including shifts in food we produce, how we produce it, and ultimately what we consume. Recently supported articulation of resilience breakthroughs include climate resilience, sustainable agri, increases in yields by 17% by 2030. Share of food production loss and per capita food waste could be halved by 2030. Healthy alternative proteins capture 15% of the global meat and seafood market by 2030. All of these are promising developments. National governments, private sector, funders, civil actors all must come together, catalyze change across the agri food system, with farmers at the center of this transition, with support provided to mitigate risks while providing funding options to bolster the resiliency. This cannot happen without the private sector. We keep talking about the role of the private sector, and I think no economy can be said to be green unless it's equitable. And we have a great deal of work left to do in this front. But it is a journey in which private sector must be the lead partner, as we heard here from my friend Ayman. This is where the power of ideas, daring financing comes into play. And this is why private sector led growth is essential. Let me start by my first question to my power team here, panelists. So, what are the key challenges to climate adaptation? And how do we operationalize in large scale the adaptation to climate change? I'd like to hear from each of you. What are you doing in this space? And what are some of the solutions you're bringing? Why don't we start?
Well, thank you very much for this important conversation. I think one of the challenges with climate adaptation is the obvious thing that there's still very much limited resources towards adaptation. A lot of the money that is currently on climate financing is going towards, emission reduction, which is, of course, is very important. But as we've heard during this conversation at COP, it's going to climate adaptation financing is going to skyrocket to about $340 billion per year by 2030. So if we are serious about addressing climate change, then certainly at least 50% of that, according to the UN Secretary General, has to go towards adaptation. So I think for me, that's an obvious thing. But within this challenge, there's a huge opportunity, right? Because we have the manpower. Our work at the World Food Program is really looking at how do we make the vulnerable, impacted communities be the climate heroes and champions of their own communities. And so we work with communities in fragile states to anticipate any climate hazards. We also work with them to restore ecosystems, but also to protect themselves from these climate shocks. So that's really kind of, I think, for me, where the opportunity lies. It is a big issue, but it's an issue that's solvable. And the more we can focus on adaptation, the easier it would be for us to address the whole climate crisis, because it's a lot more cost effective to intervene at the beginning. Adaptation is much more cost effective than constantly having to fund humanitarian crisis and, of course, recovery. So that's our why we are focusing on this as the World Food Program.
Thank you. Helmi.
Yeah, for me as a farmer from Egypt, I would say the major issue is that for both adaptation and mitigation in agriculture, we need to move to regenerative agriculture. And you can call it regenerative, organic, biodynamic, agroecology, whatever. And by moving to this agriculture, we always face an issue that it looks on the first sight as if it's more expensive, as you said, which is not the reality, because any true cost accounting exercise will prove that organic is already today much cheaper. But the economy allows us to externalize costs, either to our bills of tax bills by cleaning water and other things through another bill, or by moving it to future generations. So, having said this, it's not a solution to explain that in true cost it's cheaper, because we do this since 30 years in the movement, and still in Germany, not in Egypt, 8% of the consumers buy organic, and in Egypt it's 1%. So the price is of the essence. And I think today, through agricultural carbon credits, we have now an opportunity to move on this and to honor the farmers as climate heroes, to honor the farmers for their ecosystem services, and by providing them a fair return on the voluntary carbon market up till now, because there is no Article 6 including agriculture, but at this moment voluntary, we can, in Egypt at least, and we should check this in all countries of the world, provide them with additional incomes up to, in Egypt, 20 tons per acre of CO2 equivalent carbon per farm, smallholding farm, would give you another 400, 500 euros. And as the Egyptians here know, this is more than what any Egyptian smallholder farmer earns from his cotton, rice, or wheat. So what we prototyped the last 2 years in Egypt was with 2,000 farmers, smallholding farmers from Aswan to Alexandria, a scheme where we enabled them to move to organic farming and sell at the local market for conventional price, so no issue on the price, but get for the agricultural carbon credits an additional income which is more than 50 to 100% higher. And so they are very happy and their livelihoods improved. And we are doing a substantial service to mitigate and adapt to climate change, because this 10 to 20 tons on 10 million acres, this would be 50% of Egypt's emissions, which the 7 million climate heroes of Egypt could contribute. So I think we have now a model, and now we need to upscale it quickly. And for this, we need a functioning voluntary carbon market, of course, with some challenges I can mention later.
Right, so building on what my colleagues have said, Vodacom and Vodafone have recently done some research with farmers, both across Europe as well as within Africa, to actually speak to them and understand what they believe are the barriers. That research recently released identifies that, number one, access to information. Making sure that they have got the right information in terms of whether it be the correct crops to grow, the correct processes, how much fertilizer, etc., to use. And we do know that managing those can result in quite a lot of progress in terms of water management, in terms of emissions from use of fertilizers. The other thing that they are looking for is access to technology. We know that technology, along with the pitfalls and the dangers, brings many, many benefits. We do work in terms of precision farming. How do we actually get that to support farmers? Everything from the commercial operator and then down to how do we get that information to a small hold or even a subsistence farmer? The third thing which they've identified as a need is support from government, whether it be in subsidies or in training. And then finally, access to markets, which is a big component. And from a Vodacom perspective, we really do believe in the earlier speaker spoke about having a purpose. Our purpose is about connecting for a better future. And to that, those issues that the farmers have been identifying are ways in which we are trying to respond.
Brilliant. I mean, this is amazing examples on the ground of what is happening and what the private sector is doing and what you're doing. Now, the question is, there's so much resistance when you look at what the government. Everybody's looking at the role. Everybody thinks it's the government's role to really be driving the change. And I think finally we're sitting here saying the private sector needs to roll up its sleeves. It needs to lead the change. What are the barriers and the challenges that you think the private sector is facing? How can we propel that action and that engagement and that drive from each of your perspectives?
I mean, I think part of the challenge has been that the private sector previously has not really seen a role for themselves to play, right? I think, because this was very much led through the United Nations with member states, I think most companies didn't really see a viable role for them to play, but also a lack of understanding that this is a business imperative for them as well. When you look at most of the private sectors, they are operating in these fragile states in the developing countries. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I know that the private sector, does a lot of business in my country. And so I think the conversation now needs to move from, here's what you can get out of the continent, African continent, for example, in the developing world, but also here's what you need to put back in. But I think there are some great examples. I can talk about one very specific initiative we have as the World Food Program in Rwanda around nutrition, where we are working with the private sector and different stakeholders to create nutritious food on the continent. And so I think the more of these case studies that we see emerge that can be scaled, as you said, I think right now we have now an understanding that it's an imperative to do this work. But rather than, start from scratch, we have proven solutions that we can actually quickly scale up and really focus on this speed and transformation that's needed. So I think for me, this is the opportunity, and it's why it's a delight to be here, because it's also a business case. You know, you can't afford not to be part of this conversation and be part of the solution.
Thank you.
I mean, as Ayman said, every business in the world will have to acknowledge the issue either out of enlightenment and understanding or out of crisis. The change is coming, so it will happen, So there, I'm very sure that we will see change. But now on the example which I have just raised, and we are going to upscale to 40,000 farmers in the next 2 years, because as I told you, this example I've given you is a win-win-win. I mean, the farmer is getting a better income, consumers are getting better food, and we are creating agricultural carbon credits which are in demand. What are the issues? The one issue is, and I'm not looking to the government, I'm not looking to anyone, I'm really believing that we as civil society and social entrepreneurs will have to move first, and governments are very, very welcome to join whenever they are ready to join. I'm not waiting for them, and I'm not relating anything of what I'm going to do and to wait. So what we need is to help 40,000 farmers to reach certification, which takes a year or a year and a half. And this is a whole opportunity for all the development organizations in the world to join in. But it's an opportunity for the financial institutions, because all these farmers need to invest into renewable energy, solar pumps, need to invest into trees, cows, and so on and so on. And these are all good investments, so they don't need donations. Farmers very soon, hopefully, will be again wealthy in the society when we honor them for what they do. So they need just funding. Then we need governance for issuing carbon credits. There is a project design document and a verification and validation which needs to happen, which is internationally acknowledged so that they can access the market. I'm very happy that yesterday Egypt's government has announced the opening of a voluntary carbon market in Egypt. So we will have international and local markets for these farmers. And last but not least, there must be a commitment from the business again to buy into this voluntary carbon market and offset their remaining emissions. And let's remember one thing, our race to zero means what? There is no business in the room, including myself, which can go to zero. Unless I commit suicide and close my company, I'm not at zero. So I'm not intending to do both. So I will have emissions. So I need natural-based solutions. I need agriculture. I need forests to balance my emissions, even if I did optimize my footprint. So we need to acknowledge this, and hence there will be a growing market for this kind of ecosystem services. But we need to understand that farmers are climate heroes, and we need to honor them and pay a fair price for this service. And then they will need no donations, no whatever social support. They will be better off than many people in the cities. So this is my belief.
Because you just touched on something actually that's really important, that this idea of looking at the vulnerable communities as simply a recipient is completely wrong. As you said, you know, you have a demand issue from the carbon markets, and the supply is going to be the impoverished communities that we are currently looking down upon. And so I think it's really powerful that it will create this equal partnership that's very much needed.
Thank you. So I'm going to blend mine a little bit with the challenges, but also as a group we've actually worked to overcome some of these challenges. As I mentioned in my opening statement, a big thing is access to information. Working with the UN Broadband Commission, we did some studies on smartphone penetration across Africa, and I would say that is the first barrier. We may have some of the most amazing solutions, one called Connected Farmer, which provides farmers with access to the information, gives them the ability to tap into markets to be able to sell their produce. But that's no good if there is no connectivity and there is no access to smartphone devices. So in terms of those challenges, we work quite closely either with a group of partners where we're trying to work to expand rural access, because many of these challenges are faced in rural areas or in refugee camps. And so the first thing is we need to actually give them access to the technology and to connectivity. And then the next step, as I mentioned, is smartphone access. So that is a key barrier in terms of being able to reach the whether it be subsistence, smallhold, or even commercial farmers, is connectivity and access to the technology. And in that stage, it has to come to us as organizations to come up with innovative solutions. So whether that be really working with suppliers to come up with more affordable or entry-level smartphone devices, or finding innovative ways to allow for financing of those devices. For example, with our partners in Safaricom, they work with M-Kopa in allowing a smallhold farmer, or actually any individual, to finance a smartphone, making it far more accessible and affordable. And then in that, we also need to make sure a barrier which the farmer and ourselves have is access to finance. So through solutions such as our M-Pesa financial platform, you really need to enable people to be paid for their services. And then finally, what we have found is a challenge is you may be able to reach that person, but if they do benefit from a grant or from access to whether it be a subsidy from government, how do we ensure that that money actually gets to the individual? And through solutions like our mezzanine e-vouchering platform, we are able to actually distribute a grant direct to the smallhold farmer, who then goes and supports a local supplier to get their bag of seed or their wheelbarrow or what they need. So you are actually stimulating the economic development of that area. So a number of barriers, but the reason why we're here, what are we doing about those barriers, and how do we continue to strive to adapt our processes, adapt our products and solutions to deliver that benefit?
Brilliant. I mean, we come to COP27 and look at it as it's an Africa Cup. It's the voice of Africa, Africans uniting finally to demand that shared but differential responsibility from developed world and developed countries. And I think I mean, I'd be remiss not to ask, where do you see some cross-border opportunities for collaboration, for trying to solve? I mean, Africa should be the food basket of the world, and it should absolutely have a lot of localized solutions. And if the solutions don't come from within, they won't come from anywhere else. I'd love to hear from you about some of the lessons learned, ideas, thoughts of how can we have some cross-border collaboration in solving the food security issue. Thank you.
I mean, when we look at the climate crisis, certainly one of the conversations that has been missing from a very long time is how it connects to food systems. You know, we spoke about the climate crisis in terms of what it's going to, how it's damaging the planet and the environment. And now we are actually seeing that the climate crisis is a big contributor of global hunger. We have 828 million people right now who are going to bed hungry. If we increase emission just by 2 degrees, it's going to be another, 500 million people in total that will go to bed hungry. And so the really exciting opportunity for me in this is that we know climate is no border. So it's no longer a luxury to think about how and if we should be collaborating. We have to actually work together, because what happens in Africa is not going to stay in Africa. Not only is it a big issue around food security, but also migration. We are seeing people flee their homes and their security. I will tell you a very concrete example here. I was in Egypt just 5 months ago before COP, seeing some of our World Food Program projects in Upper Egypt. And I met a farmer called Anwar, and Anwar has 4 children. His eldest is a son, the second child is a girl, and when severe drought hit his community, 2 of the eldest had to drop out of school. The boy ended up working on the farm, but because girls can't work in the farm in Upper Nile, he ended up having the young girl got married, to a much older person. Sadly, it never worked out, so she got divorced and she came back home with a child. And when I met with him, it was also really interesting, because I think another conversation here is around the gender dimension of the climate crisis. It's the girls, it's the women that suffer the most. They eat last and they eat least. And in some cases, they end up getting into child marriage. And so this idea of siloing climate change is just no longer a viable option. We actually have to collaborate across different sectors, but also South-to-South cooperation is also really key for us, is the World Food Program, because it will create other ripple effects and other socio-economic state issues and making communities that are already vulnerable even more vulnerable. So for me, the opportunity is significant.
Amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. I think this model which we have found for Egypt needs adaptation to every other country, every other context. We have appointed our SECAM ambassador. She is going around Africa now and trying to find farmers who want to prototype and want to test. I'm sure the results will be like ours or even better. So this is great, but then it needs still local commitment of associations, organizations, and so on. From the other side, as I said, in Egypt, to go up to 40,000 and then in 2 years to 250,000 farmers needs the development of this whole chain. And I'm very happy that finally now we are also starting to work cross development organizations on such projects. And the silos are not only silos of private sector believing that he must keep secrets or something. It's also between the international organizations. You allow me to say this. I'm very happy that we are now going to include the 35,000 farmers the World Food Program has developed in South Egypt into our scheme in the next phase. So this is great, and this is immediately a synergy. And I hope that we can do something like this, because technology indeed could be increasing efficiency, all kinds of technology, and it's about carbon measurement, it's about GIS technology, it's about mobile phones. The technology can serve such a better regenerative food system in many, many ways, as you said, including now issuing the carbon credits and providing them on the voluntary carbon exchange, and so on and so on. So there are unlimited possibilities to do it better, quicker, and more efficient. So I call for cooperation between all countries, not only Africa. We are speaking about Africa, but the same goes for South America and Asia, of course. I'm calling for cooperation between business, development organizations, associations, and so on, and between different projects to really make it happen and to get the best possible results for the smallholder farmers.
Thank you. Building on that, I think the collaboration is very, very important, not only externally, but within your own organization. I work for a multinational organization, and it is very important that sometimes you start from within and understand what each entity has and how that can translate into another area. For example, our connected farmer solution, which is aimed at smallhold farmers, the genesis was in South Africa. However, we knew and we saw the potential for it to work in other markets. But very importantly, as Ayman said earlier, it must be localized. You can't take a one size fits all, and that solution needs to be structured in a way that is relevant, and then that's the collaboration on the local level and with local partners. So our connected farmer is not a one size fits all. It is the application in Kenya. It's called DigiFarm and has different nuances, different functionalities which are relevant for that market. Whereas in Tanzania, with Mkulima, it is again structured slightly differently, working with different partners to make sure that it is suitable for each what we call opcos. So I think that's the first thing, is starting to look within. And then also to just challenge ourselves and constantly look at what is happening in the world, to ensure that there could be technologies which are working elsewhere, and we need to bring those in. So, for example, in our Vodafone markets in Europe, they've got some very exciting issues around fire detection. In some of our countries, we've had that issue. IoT Next is one of our subsidiaries that works specifically in water, because that we know is a pressing issue. So how do we actually, again, engage and make sure that it is relevant to the local market? And in that cross-border collaboration, how we may engage in one country will look different in the next country. We may work more commercially in country A, but then in country B, we may work more with a government partner or with a third business partner. So I think that the opportunities are there. Sometimes it takes patience, nurturing to get things done. But then when you respect and understand what the local requirements are, what the needs are, I think then it's more successful to take things across border.
Thank you. I think we're starting to reach the end of our time. I'd like to open the floor for Q&As, but first I really want to thank Yamayaro for giving us the World Food Programs and international organizations perspective, what's going on, what's happening, the amount of improvements, progress that's happening on the ground, a social entrepreneur's perspective on the potential of carbon markets, and so much that can be done to empower the farmer, and Nola for looking at from a multinational perspective of how you can be global and local, and how can you really do knowledge transfer and technology transfer. I'd like to open it to the floor for questions just for 5 minutes.
What? Okay, I'm Ismail again. I'm sorry. Well, actually, it's not a question, and it's actually a gratitude for the panelists. And we have not coordinated. I swear. I mean, we've not even met and talked. But actually, if we're talking about the example of the plane and the people who are sitting on the business class, I think you would say the three Elizabeth, Helmi and Nola are basically for sure business class riders, right? And now we have seen Elizabeth knows Anwar, who sits back on the economy and actually talks about him, in a very, very personal way. And Helmi calls, the farmers the kings. We're talking here about relevancy of basically, what those people need. That's the reality. That's the reality of how we're going to make difference. And I think these are the role models that we're seeing today. And I really want to give you gratitude for an amazing panel and for actually showing the power that we can all do together. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I am Collins Gamali Odoli from University of Environment and Sustainable Development, Ghana. On emissions, my questions will be tailored towards that. So the first part, we need to consider that agriculture is both a source of air pollution and a recipient, in the sense that some agricultural practices, for instance, the slash and burn practices, is a huge contributor to air pollution within the continent of Africa or even the West African sub-region. And so how do we find a balance between that and also food production? Because if you talk about agriculture again, you want to produce. Air pollution impact on crop yield and all of that. So where do we find the balance? The other part has to do with, I haven't really found a lot of studies which is linking air quality or location-specific agricultural practices on local air quality. So what really influences the kind of approaches you are employing in the region of Africa? Then on technology, how is it sustainable? For instance, you talk about the farmers paying for the smart devices or the phones that they have to use. How do we sustain that? Then the last bit has to do with climate smart agriculture. Have we thought about using sensors, low-cost sensors, for instance, on fire detection? If you should have a device which is deployed within a particular area of farming community, you're not just looking at air quality, but you're also looking at if the levels spike, it means that maybe there's a fire incident at the farming area, which means that you can trigger the farmers to go. So that could be an opportunity where you create a business for graduates that are with IT background or related to be working on that, where farmers without the technical know-how on how to use the devices can just engage in the farming. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lots of questions in there. So I think most importantly, we are a technology company, so it is very important for us to engage with subject matter experts. And that is why, for example, we established a partnership. Well, we actually bought them in the end because we believe in what they're doing, Mezzanine, who are absolute specialists in terms of agriculture. And we have agronomists. They are the ones who will continue to do research, will always be investigating, looking at new practices. And I think the key thing is it's about providing information. It's not about dictating to the smallhold farmer what they should do and what they shouldn't do. We need to understand that actually should they have the correct information. And then the other thing which we do is we work with a lot of partners to deliver training. So for example, in the DRC, we work with Agro Mwenda, who are actually working with the farmers, ensuring, number one, to your point, do they know how to use the technology, first of all, because there's no point in having it if you can't use it. But then secondly, building that out into through the chain, looking at agri, but also looking at basic business practices. If we want them to be, to your question around how does it become sustainable, and that is the process of financial education and literacy. How can they use technology to access markets? But then how do you plan? How do you make sure that you're not going to actually not have the money for the next, perhaps the next round of seeds that you need? In terms of your question around how do we bring advanced technology and how do we empower locals, this is something we're very, very keen to continue to work on. This is a new journey. Vodacom for many years was a telecommunications company, but we've seen the potential. So we talk about our shift from telco to techco. And as we identify those new opportunities, the example of fire detection is something we've picked up in Europe, but we know it's something that is beneficial. So I think it will take time, it'll take engagement, and finding again that localization. We can't take a solution that's built for Europe and just stick it in. We know that's not going to be a winner at all. So we need to actually go on that journey.
I would just add on, and I think we're going to speak about the same things actually. I'm just going to add on to that because I think it's such a misstep to tell farmers not to burn their crop when you don't give them the alternative. It's just unrealistic because people have to survive. And so in Upper Egypt, and I'm sure you're aware of this, the World Food Program has been supporting smallholder farmers. And one of the things that we focus on is on this burning. And so we have invested in machinery for them to take their waste and actually grind it, which then becomes feed for their animals. Also, on the last question around, I'm speaking fast because I think we're about to wrap up. And we can sidebar on the issue of engaging the community in Mwanza in Zambia. The World Food Program has a project there where we are working with smallholder farmers to crowdsource for data. So early warning is so key in all this, and so technology becomes so critical. They are gathering all the weather patterns. And through technology, we are then providing them with early warning signs about when to plant their crops. Even simple things like, what time should you water irrigate your field, because we know that today the sun is going to set at this time and rise at this time and rest at this hour. So all these things are important. What seeds to plant, early warning is really critical. So I'm going to turn over to you because I'm sure you can talk about the Egypt experience as well.
Just to say it very, very quickly from Egypt. In Egypt, the average acre is emitting today 5 tons of CO2 equivalent, okay? Emitting. And I'm speaking about sequestration of 10 to 20 tons. You see the difference? Now, why is it like this? Also, farmers in Egypt since 5,000 years in their hands, even if they are illiterate, have more knowledge than many academic people in the agricultural faculties of the universities, okay? Because they are forced by a certain system to apply certain things like chemical fertilizers and pesticides and other, and it looks very cheap and it looks very nice, and it's the only economic system which works. Because the moment they go to regenerative agriculture and they have to apply compost and I don't know what, then it looks as if it's more expensive, as we said, okay? They give them the chance to do it, and you will see the miracles happening. They know what to do. They don't need, they need technology, yes, but don't try to explain to them what is agriculture. They have this in their blood, okay? But give them the chance to do a good job, and they will, as I said, be climate heroes and do a fantastic story. And then honor them and pay them for their ecosystem service, and they will have a better income. And then the issue of the whole society, including women, girls, men, and boys, will be dealt with by them.
Thank you, Helmi. Thank you all. The nexus of food, energy, water, and technology is key. But we cannot forget the indigenous knowledge that exists in our people, especially in Africa, on the ground. So together, we will find climate action and solutions that will have affordable food for everybody, sustainable future for us all. Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting session. I want to thank my panelists and the engagement of the audience here and all the good questions. Thank you.
Madam Gada, I'm going to ask you all to just take a seat so our photographer can take a beautiful picture of all of you, if you don't mind. So we'll get the smiles back. And while we do that, we can give them a real round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. It was an absolutely fantastic conversation, and thank you very much, Madam Gada, for an excellent job. As they take those photos, allow me just to reiterate some of the big points that we heard. Community at the center, heroes of their own stories. Have we asked the questions, what do farmers actually need? Have we reminded ourselves that there are gender dynamics we need to think about? And of course, remember, climate has no borders. Thank you very much for that conversation. You may descend off the stage. Thank you.